Welcome to the News Roundup for Wednesday, December 24, 2025. I'm Bill Thomas. Merry Christmas to all, and here's what's happening right now. Congressional investigators say the Walz are rapidly closing in on Governor Tim Walz as they widen their probe into the roots of Minnesota's massive welfare fraud scandal. A number of vocal critics pinning part of the blame squarely on biased local media sources for failing to hold the state's leaders, such as Walz and Ilhan Omar, accountable for allowing those taxpayer ripoff schemes to continue. And in Washington, more than 100 Democratic lawmakers are desperately urging the Trump administration to reconsider a significant new rule concerning potential new immigrants and their right to government assistance. Also, the Supreme Court weighs in on Trump's bid to deploy the National Guard to Chicago, and we'll go ahead and make your day by revealing the 5 legendary Hollywood superstars who mistakenly turned down the iconic role of Dirty Harry. All this and much more coming up right now on the holiday edition of the Big Roundup. We have a great deal to get to today, and we begin on Capitol Hill, where the rapidly expanding congressional investigation into Governor Tim Walz and his colossal Minnesota fraud scandal is growing more comprehensive every single day. The top lawmaker in the House Oversight Committee says that based on what they're learning, it's now gotten to the point where the fallout from Walz's lack of oversight, it's impacting every single person who lives in Minnesota. I have family there, and I tell you, they are none too pleased. He goes on to claim that because so much money was tossed away, wasted, and defrauded by that state's Somali community, they're now having to drastically cut a number of services which are in fact desperately needed by the rest of the population. Well, I guess that's okay so long as a bunch of crooks got rich. Additionally, Oversight Chairman James Comer says his committee, now working day and night alongside a number of other federal agencies to track down all the missing cash, find out where eventually wound up, and discover the people who are directly responsible for the crimes. And like they said all those years ago, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. He also says that no matter what, they're planning to subpoena all the relevant records and testimony they can get their hands on as part of their ongoing investigation, including by bringing a bunch of whistleblower state employees and other officials to D.C. and putting them all under oath. I think you know the racket by now. You know the drill. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Learned all about that by watching that Judge Wapner program. In the meantime, Comer says that right now the Walz, they're rapidly closing in on Walz, also claims that by now the governor has lost credibility with the American people, that no one in our country believes he's able to fix the problem, and that nevertheless he deserves the due process which the community plans to give him. Now, for his part, the beleaguered governor's team says this is all part of a coordinated political attack aimed at silencing one of President Trump's most effective critics. Not so much. In fact, he's entirely ineffective. Furthermore, Walz is doubling down and claiming that the immigration crackdown that's presently taking place in the Twin Cities, nothing more than political theater, which is being orchestrated by Trump to deflect attention away from the president's own personal crimes. Sorry, America, my bad. Apparently, it was 47 who stole $9 billion from Minnesota. He's also warning his citizens to prepare for what he calls an increasing number of ICE enforcement actions in the immediate future, including the possibility that agents could target religious gatherings over the holidays. And that's called deflection, with a little cherry on the very tippy top. Final thoughts, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown, and here's how it's all panning out. As a general rule in life, nobody gets away with anything, but a few select individuals will always give it the college try because they think they're the smartest guy in the room. You know, unfortunately for this guy, if he was locked up alone in a one-room cell, in a dungeon, on a desert island, he still wouldn't be the smartest guy in the room. Here's the deal. Nearly everybody is on to the Timnacious one, and there's absolutely no way he can authentically claim, as he's done in the past, that he knew nothing, while billions of dollars worth of fraud was happening and on his watch. 5 years now or more worth of legendary scams going down in his state. Scams which have harmed nearly every citizen who trusted him to be Minnesota's Grand Poobah, their CEO. To be abundantly fair, and to his credit, that state's favorite son, Governor Tim Walz, he may know how to play the game well at the state level, but now he's going up against the big boys. The feds are now breathing down his neck, crunching the numbers and pulling out all the stops to get to the bottom of one of the biggest capers in the history of, well, capering. Yeah, you know the drill. And like they always say, what did he know and when did he know it? I kind of stole that from Hannity. Final note, Governor Tim is now saying that, yeah, there's a problem, but he's the guy to fix it, and he's planning on running for governor a third time. Now, think this all the way through. Do you really trust him to balance the books in Minnesota? Personally, I wouldn't trust this guy to balance my checkbook. But what do you think? Drop us a comment. Tell us why you either would or would not give this guy the keys to the Minnesota kingdom. Actually wants a third term as the governor. All right, we'll stick with the Minnesota fraud scandal just a bit longer now on account of it's Christmas. And it's a Christmas gift that just kind of keeps on giving. Or stealing, depending on how you look at it. And we'll turn our attention to allegations concerning the region's local media outlets and their apparent complicity in enabling the massive welfare schemes to snowball. Outraged critics who work for news outlets throughout the state now coming out of the woodwork, and they claim they were told repeatedly by their bosses they couldn't hold Governor Tim Walz and his cronies accountable in the press for what was going on because if they ran any stories dealing with the area's Somali community, they would all be labeled as racists. Yeah, you got to play that race card. I get that. Meanwhile, a number of people, they're now taking it a bit further and vilifying the state's largest newspaper. They call that one the Minnesota Star-Tribune, and they claim that in part through their misleading headlines. This organization is nothing more than a front for Democrats, which has been repeatedly covering up important information, contorting the facts, and simply lying outright. Taking up just a notch, one congressman from the state's also pinning the blame on Minnesota's most widely read paper. Says that instead of maintaining journalistic integrity, like we do right here on the Roundup, and holding leaders such as Tim Walz and Ilhan Omar accountable for their roles in the massive taxpayer swindle, the paper has proven itself to be nothing more than a highly biased communist fish wrap. And now I kind of want fish for dinner. Now, when you take a closer look and peek under the hood, you can see that the congressman may have had a very valid point. See, the paper's CEO, it's a guy named Steve Grove, and he worked directly for the Walz administration as the governor's commissioner of employment and economic development. That was between 2019 and 2023, if memory serves correct, and if the teleprompter I'm looking at is correct. For their part, the Minnesota Star-Tribune says any notion that they're downplaying the fraud crisis in any way can be contradicted by making a simple Google search. They also claim they were the first organization to report that the Walz administration was withholding information related to the scandal, that they've been broken countless stories holding state leaders accountable for their oversight failures related to the massive theft, and that so far they've published more reporting about the Feeding Our Future fraud than any other media outlet in the country. Except maybe the News Roundup. In the meantime, the lack of valid coverage by the local media also seemingly being echoed on the national stage. One conservative watchdog group reporting that even as the scandal began to break and started growing by leaps and bounds, the major American news networks, they're all kind of downplaying the fraud angle and focusing their attention more on President Trump's response. Final thought, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. Throughout all of Minnesota, if radio and television stations, newspapers, and other media outlets have refrained from fair and comprehensive coverage of all that's happening in a state where virtually every citizen has reportedly been ripped off, I say thanks a million, or actually 9 million. Actually 9 billion. And here in the News Roundup newsroom, we are more than happy to pick up the slack. The past several days and weeks, we've been watching very carefully the stories coming out of Walz land, and we are more than happy to share those stories with anybody who frowns upon fraud, corruption, and thievery. This Walz guy sounds like a pickpocket on steroids. And I would like to think that what's happening in Minnesota is kind of an isolated event, but, a number of Rounduppers, just like you and my pal Patty Kay, my buddy Eric as well, they've written in to point out similar issues percolating in Ohio, Oregon, and a bunch of other states as well. Now, our Christmas gift to you. We're going to keep unwrapping all we know about everything that's happening in Minnesota and our pilfered tax dollars. Look at the News Roundup as kind of a major motion picture starring Governor Tim Walz, along with his co-star, that state's Attorney General Keith Ellison, and special guest star, we can't leave her out, multi-millionaire Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. This has all the makings of one of those big, giant Hollywood blockbusters. And producer Davey, if you don't mind, I know you're sitting in the background somewhere, grab us some popcorn and maybe a Dr. Pepper. And this time, go easy on the ice. It melts and gets kind of watery. All right, change things up just a bit now and turning to a story concerning immigration, welfare, and the right to become a U.S. citizen. More than 100 Democratic lawmakers now up in arms over a rule change proposed by the Trump administration, which would grant immigration officers the authority to keep an immigrant from entering our country if they determine the individual can't get by without without government assistance. In a letter to the Department of Homeland Security, the lawmakers say the agency's modified and broadened public charge rule is totally vague. No, it's not. It has no clear standards. Actually, it kind of does. And would result in damaging and arbitrary decision-making, ultimately leading to widespread fear and confusion. 100% malarkey. I like that one. I stole that from Joe Biden. Malarkey. They also claim that if it goes into effect as planned, the new measure would wind up harming a large number of American children, immigrant communities, and public health systems nationwide, including by scaring people away from lawful access to much-needed welfare programs dealing with healthcare, nutrition, and more. The lawmakers go on to say that by replacing the current Biden-era regulations, the proposal undermines the rule of law and could end up hurting children, increasing food insecurity, and shifting the financial burden for fixing the mess to state and local governments. Stop with the fear-mongering already. As a result, they're now asking the Department of Homeland Security to reconsider their decision, withdraw the proposal altogether, and leave the current immigration rules just the way they are. Which sounds like a Billy Joel song from the 1970s. Editor Pranoff, if you could we see Billy Joel, that smiling face? Final thought, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. In the words of the great one, Ronald Reagan, there you go again.
There you go again.
There's nothing more than fear-mongering on the part of Democrats who are weak on immigration and who thrive on spending our tax dollars on supporting those who are ill-equipped to support themselves upon entering the U.S. Fad designs on pulling up stakes and setting up shop in Costa Rica, Switzerland, or for the most part, any foreign country. I'd only do so if I could make that move and support myself, and I wouldn't go somewhere and depend or demand that country's government to feed me, to house me, to provide free health care for me. More importantly, I can't think of a country on the planet that would allow me in with open arms if they thought I simply was there for a free handout. You'll also recall, the Biden administration doing nothing to ensure border security, which led to unchecked illegal immigration, increased crime as well, and the financial toll, most likely, still being sorted out. Bottom line, DHS, they're doing the right thing. The public charge rule harms absolutely nobody. Rather, it helps to ensure that those who come to the USA do so wholly prepared to support themselves and their family, and without having to tap into assistance from the federal government. This is the Democrats once again doing all they can to tax you to pay for someone else who can't or won't fend for themselves, and it's entirely unsustainable. We'll switch things up now, and as people throughout our country gather together with friends and loved ones to celebrate the spirit of the season, China is responding by launching a massive crackdown in their nation on anything related to Christmas. Look at them getting all Grinchified and such. And just in time for the holidays, the communist regime is now reportedly clamping down, ordering a number of sweeping police raids and putting the lid on religious displays or celebrations, which they say threatens to undermine their authority. Calm down. All right, so China's Grinch-like president, that smiling mug right there, check out that guy, President Xi Jinping and his communist cronies. They oversee some of the strictest controls over organized religion in the entire world, often suppressing, arresting, and even torturing people for their beliefs. Additionally, worshiping outside of state-sanctioned churches strictly forbidden. And right now, people say the communist regime is in the midst of a nationwide hunt for underground meeting houses. Hello, Big Brother. In the meantime, those efforts have not escaped the watchful eyes of the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio speaks for all of us when he says that we condemn China's actions and that the crackdown further demonstrates the Chinese Communist Party's hostility toward Christians. Now, some additional headlines we're keeping a very close watch on here in the News Roundup newsroom. And first up, the Supreme Court rejecting the Trump administration's bid to deploy National Guard troops to Chicago and saying the president's authority to do so likely only applies in exceptional circumstances. Unchecked crime, including a high murder rate. In my mind, that sounds rather exceptional. Education Department saying that beginning next month, they'll begin garnishing wages and docking the pay of millions of delinquent student loan borrowers who are behind in their payments. Look, you borrow the dough, simply pay it back. It's pretty basic. And in health news, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, giving a thumbs up and approving the first Wegovy pill for weight loss, potentially impacting millions of Americans. Get off the needles and on to the pills. And now a quick gander at a bit of rock and roll showbiz news. And today we kick things off by checking out an unfunny moment for a well-known Hollywood comedian. 82-year-old funny man Chevy Chase. Well, he used to be funny. Now revealing that being completely left out of the recent Saturday Night Live 50th anniversary special was very upsetting to him. I think he's going to cry. And furthermore, he has no idea why it happened. Well, he kind of does. And I kind of do too. Goes on to say that right up to the very last moment, he really thought he was going to have a part on the show, and insiders are now blaming the omission on the comedian's volatile relationship with the producer Lorne Michaels. He's a TV institution. Here's the thing about Chevy Chase. Yeah, he's hilarious, or used to be, and he was one of the original not ready for primetime players. Unfortunately, word around town is that Mr. Chase doesn't always play well with others. And to keep the show on the right track, he was politely excused from the big celebration, from the big program. However, think it through, the 75th anniversary show, that's coming up in only a quarter of a century. It's only 25 years out. And if Mr. Chase behaves, he might be invited to take part in the big event. He'll be 129, but he might be invited back. More now concerning a Hollywood blockbuster which was released just before Christmas back in 1971, which helped turn its leading man into an international superstar. No, not this mug, Tiny Tim, the other superstar, the great Clint Eastwood. He cemented his legend when he stepped into the role of Dirty Harry. But believe it or not, only got the gig because a number of other Tinseltown giants, they turned the part down. Among them, Robert Mitchum, the tough guy, a guy named Steve McQueen as well, the race car driver, also a little-known lounge singer, Frank Sinatra, Paul Newman, and even the Duke himself, John Wayne, said, no, I don't want that part. Well, they clearly had a ton of good choices, but in the end, they chose wisely. I've seen the picture a dozen or more times, and clearly the producers of that film, they made my day. And hey, editor Pranov the Magnificent, can we get a shot of that little BB gun that Inspector Callahan always carried around town in that Dirty Harry picture? Looks somewhat intimidating. I hear it had a bit of a recoil or kick, as far as I can tell. Never had one myself. And now the long-awaited holiday finally upon us, and in the spirit of the season, many of us look forward to kicking back on the couch, picking up the remote, and checking out some of our favorite Christmas classics. According to one list on IMDb, the 5 best holiday movies of all time include It's a Wonderful Life, also Home Alone, I think that's one with Macaulay Culkin, also Die Hard, A Christmas Carol, and, of course, Elf with Will Ferrell. Those are, for the most part, kind of my 5 favorites as well, but they left out the cartoon edition of The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, and that is clearly one of the best of all time. And by the way, there are a number of versions of A Christmas Carol. Be careful. Choose wisely. The correct version to watch is from 1951, and that's the one starring Alastair Sim. And now time for us to call it a wrap here on the Big News Roundup. So have an awesome day. Enjoy your Christmas holiday. Stay safe. And if you haven't done so already, don't forget to hit that little subscribe button right there. And with that, Editor Pranov again, Pranov the Magnificent. If you would, please, I'm going to jump into this beast right here, the News Roundup jet helicopter, and go cruise around town for a couple of hours. And now we're going to dim the lights, fade to black, and we'll see you right back here on Monday for a brand new edition of the Big News Roundup.